Today we're going to be going over what happiness really is and how to get it. Welcome to session 2 of Living Over Surviving. My name is Noah, and when we aren't really taught where happiness comes from, typically we're going to default to whatever's immediate and apparent. This will happen easily 99% of the time. And these things usually involve short-term gratification, and these are things that don't really lead to happiness. Drugs, alcohol, sex, material possessions, insane luxury vacations, maybe. Maybe it's being popular and the status that comes along with it, or the romanticized idea of a relationship or a job or kind of status. While these things sound really great on the surface, none of them really translate to long-term happiness, satisfaction, or even freedom from anxiety. Because when we think about these things, typically we're just going to move the goalposts and look to the next one, right? And we end up putting ourselves in this constant state of wanting. And when we're there, we never really allow ourselves to get satisfied. When we get tired of being in that cycle, it feels like nothing's working and we're kind of backed into a corner. And that's very easily where depression or thoughts of doing bad things to ourselves can very easily start to creep in, because then everything feels as if it's worthless, because everything that we chased, that we thought would bring us happiness, simply didn't. And so the framework that we're going to cover today is all about how we can get out of that cycle and start living meaningfully and happily. And it's made by Dr. Robert Spitzer. It's called The 4 Levels of Happiness, and he's the Chief Education Officer of the Ethics and Performance Institute. And it gives us a lot of context into the different kinds of happiness there are, how they affect us, and how we can actually navigate the pursuit of happiness so that we don't actually fall into one of those cycles and end up wanting to off ourselves. Since I already explained the 4 levels in session 0, I'm actually just going to replay those sections, and then I'll jump in and add things to each part. So this time it'll be a way fuller picture. So here we go. Level 1 is instant gratification, right? And so this is typically going to be with respect to hedonism and things like that, not necessarily just drug addicts in particular, but we all have a particular weakness to something. Maybe it's smoking, maybe it's drinking, maybe it's sex, etc. But typically, what instant gratification is going to do, it's usually physiological, right? It could be even as something as innocent as your favorite meal, but it's only ever a problem when you actually make it the biggest part of your life, right? Like when it occupies too much of your thoughts in the day, then it's like, ooh, maybe you have a problem. Because then you're allowing other aspects of your life to fall short, and maybe you're not maintaining the other areas where you should be maintaining them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so in the graph here for level 1, we start off at our baseline. And so we have time on the X, happiness on the Y, and we have a pretty solid progression upwards, right? It's decently steep, because whenever we look for instant gratification, usually we're very intentional. And so one instance I could think of where that usually is the case for pretty much everyone is looking for a porn video, right? Like you are in the zone, right? You are not thinking of anything else. Like you are focused, right? You're like, you got that flow state. Absolutely. And so when you have that kind of focus, that's why you're able to progress so quickly upwards and reach your peak in such a short amount of time relative to the other levels. And so here we're grinding our way up. Maybe that's the waiter coming down the aisle with our food. Maybe that's us rolling the joint. Maybe that's us actually finding that video that we want. And then the peak is obviously when we get that hit that we want. And so maybe that's an orgasm. Maybe that's actually getting high, or maybe that's getting your fix from a particular drink or something like that. When we have these, it's usually pretty instantly that we look for the next one, right? And so that's why there's such a steep drop off. It's because whenever we have that high and we instantly aren't in that state anymore, we just automatically look for the next one. And so if you notice, it's not a mistake, but we actually go even below the baseline whenever we actually come down from that high. And that's because then we're not necessarily just in the state of, ooh, maybe I should go grab it, or maybe I should go for it again, but we're actually, or rather, we've just lost it, right? And so we're actually just below the baseline because like, oh, well, now I got to start over, or you're just thinking about the next one. And chances are it'll take a little longer. And so the slope is a bit less steep, because then when we build up a tolerance to it, sort of like when you have a drug tolerance, then it'll take more of a dose to actually get that same effect, right? But nothing will ever be as good as your first one, right? Especially if you do this sort of thing habitually. And so whenever we actually participate in this kind of happiness, you'll notice that the peaks for each high actually get lower, and it takes us a little bit longer to get there. And so overall, that just means that we're declining, and usually that's the case where people become drug addicts. Like, that's a very, very easy example to use, because then you see people trying to go for really high doses, and it's usually never enough. And that's why their lives take such a steep decline, right? Because then they sell everything trying to get that first hit, even though they physiologically can't anymore. So overall, yeah, your peaks will get lower and lower and steeper, and that's usually where you find those kinds of people on the street, or where depression could very easily set in, or you overdose or you kill yourself or something like that. Because, I mean, mind you, these are very, very extreme examples, but it's only ever a really big problem when you put all your eggs into level 1 or to level 2, 3, 4, right? Because you could be in all 4 levels at once, right? Like, just because you're pursuing something higher, like level 3 or 4, it doesn't mean you don't actually get any satisfaction from anything else, right? Like, I could certainly enjoy a drink. I could certainly enjoy drinking with you guys. It's just a matter of how we incorporate these things into our lives. And that's the main difference. So that was very beautifully said, but there's something I do want to clarify. I misspoke when I said instantly, and that's because we only used the example of a drug addict, where typically they're the ones going to want hit after hit in kind of rapid succession. This doesn't happen for normal people, right? None of us are on Fent, especially if you're listening to a show like this. I can guarantee it. I mean, it'd be really impressive if you were a Fent user and still listening to a show like this. Like, whatever. That'd be crazy. But in level 1, one thing I want to really reiterate, it's that it's mainly about the thing that we put on the pedestal, right? The thing that occupies too much of our thoughts, and we hold it in disproportionately high regard, right? Like, if we're always mentally somewhere else or doing something else, it's certainly something to reflect on that, because then it takes away from our lived experience in the present, right? And so it's about what we make the focal point of our lives and the value that we think we're extracting from that thing. If we're diminishing our lived experience, because we're always either living in the future, anticipating that high, or in the past, when we remember and reminisce about previous highs, that makes everything else in the present really shitty. Because we're always in the present. So over time, when we're always living in the future or in the past, we start to neglect ourselves in the present. And we do that with the state of wanting, right? Maybe people live this way because they're escaping something, or reality isn't engaging enough for them, and they need maybe an artificial means of having a good time, or they at least perceive it to be a good time. When we make instant gratification our primary form of happiness, it takes away meaning from all other aspects of our lives. And so our relationships start to deteriorate. Our other responsibilities kind of get thrown into the back burner because we're so fixated on getting whatever we want. Like, we have a one-track mind. And when things over time start to fall apart, maybe your partner leaves you because maybe you're devoting too much time. You're not putting as much effort into the relationship, or you start getting reprimanded at your job because you're simply not even focused. A lot of these things only contribute to that cycle further because they start to stress you out, right? So what do we do when our present experience is bombarded with negativity? We're going to be mentally elsewhere in the place that we want, or we're going to focus on it and even want that thing even more. There was one analogy that I actually had written down for that episode, and it was that people living in level 1 live like dogs. They're solely focused on immediate rewards, right? Like they're hedonists, they're drug addicts, sex addicts, whatever. That's literally the prompt. And so drug addicts are an easy example because of how easy they are to kind of map out in terms of level 1 happiness. They fit the graph quite well. And if you're listening to an audio only version of this, I strongly recommend you to take a look at the video version, even for a little bit, because that has the little happiness and graphs that we go through together. Obviously, I try to describe it for audio listeners, but I don't know. It just doesn't do it justice. And drug addicts are really this low-hanging fruit for this example. All right, so just apply this concept to your life, see what things you may be putting on the pedestal, and we need to realize that all of these different things lead to not happiness, but emptiness. And we don't really want to put a band-aid on a wound that's only getting bigger the more we ignore it. And we want to actually treat it. And that's with a higher level form of happiness. Only typically level 3 or 4 will fix that. And so that's it for level 1. Let's move on to level 2. Level 2 is ego gratification. So this one it's marginally better in that now we're actually looking outside of ourselves, right? So now we're not exactly going to be so self-absorbed where now we're thinking, oh, I just want, whatever vice I want at the time, right? And so instead here we incorporate people, but it's sadly not in a very healthy way. And so ego gratification is exactly just that. And so it's the ego where we want to be above others, right? Like our egos are so inflated that we want to be better than everyone else and we want everyone to know it, right? And so that usually manifests itself in the form of someone maybe one-upping you in social situations, right? Like if you have a story, they got to tell one better. If something bad happened to you, they got to tell you something worse that happened to them. Like all these terrible, terrible people, like they're so horrendously inept socially because all they care about is social validation, right? And so it's sort of a step in the right direction because, we bring in others into the equation, but we do so very, very poorly. And that's also, something that we could also be prone to, right? Like, okay, I want to press a girl. I got to look, a certain way, or I got to act a certain way. And maybe that involves me putting down someone in the group so that I look better, right? Like all these little things, they do happen and they happen to everyone, but it's only a problem if you do this for your only source of happiness, right? And
Damn. Okay.
most people are usually in levels 1 and 2 because that's immediate and apparent. And that's the problem. And so here, when we go back to the graph, time on the X, happiness on the Y, we have a rather, it's a very, very lazy, not very steep slope up. And that's because we actually have to build these social connections, right? And so here we're trying to build our social connections. We're getting there. We're telling these stories. We're building the connections. We are also incorporating that kind of toxic behavior into our interactions with the group. And that's why we're actually growing or going up on our happiness scale, right? Because as we get more validation, the happier we become. And then when we get to our peak, we don't really acknowledge that the peak is there, because then we don't really know when the decline occurs. Because now that we've incorporated other people, that's not something we can control. And so when you have all this toxic behavior, when you ruin every interaction that you have because you want to be the best at everything, and you put everyone else down and you want everyone else to love you, that's when people start pushing you away the most, right? Because then no one wants to be around you because you're an asshole, right? And so when that starts to happen, and when people finally get fed up with you, maybe you get ghosted, maybe they start making other group chats without you in it, whatever it is, they shun you. If you go, oh, hey guys, what you doing? Then that's when your happiness starts to decline, because now your only source of happiness, which is that group, is leaving you, right? And then when it becomes apparent, that's when you actually get to the steep slope down. Because it's usually not very common that people just outright cut off ties, right? Like usually people just ghost each other, or they start ignoring, and then it slowly fades away. But it's when the realization sets in that we have that steeper decline downwards, and that's level 2. And then when we get below our baseline, that's when we realize, well, shit, now I need to find a new group. So yeah, level 2 is when we essentially want to be the focus of attention, or when we're the object of admiration or envy, and we kind of feel this air of superiority about ourselves, right? Pretty much just a superiority complex. And if you see every little social function as a competition, chances are you fall into this category, sadly. But this is also very different from wanting friendships and connections, and even connections at arm's length, because we could still have them healthily and not have toxic environments when we approach them the right way. Now, of course, these are just extreme examples for both levels 1 and 2, but secure people with direction will have very mild relationships with both levels, right? Like you're enjoying your favorite dessert or enjoying getting a compliment. There's nothing wrong with those things. It's only ever a problem when we go crazy with it and it becomes too much of a focus in our lives. Right? Like when we start putting people down publicly and make things all about you, or you throw everything into the back burner to try and get some particular thing, then it's something to worry about. But level 2 certainly doesn't encompass a desire to simply be liked by others, or to fit into a community. That's really healthy, actually. To have the desire to fit in and be liked by others and have meaningful and deep relationships, like this should be encouraged. But we just have to be aware of that distinction between having friends for their company and companionship versus as a means to feed your superiority complex. And it appears as though this is something that's prevalent in every age. I remember that being walked through a particular book by St. Augustine called The City of God, where he talks about something called the libido dominandi, which is the lust of domination, where you want to get to the absolute top of the food chain. Pretty much just level 2 on steroids, right? So there are cunts in every age. And sure, while it's a nice thing to aim high, and that's certainly something we also should encourage, once you get to a certain point and you have that relatively comfortable lifestyle, things usually just end up as levels 1 or 2 anyways, right? Either the hedonic treadmill or a superiority complex. And if you're struggling with level 2 in particular, one thing I'd like to note for you is that one of the root causes of this is actually emotional underdevelopment. It's not included in Dr. Spitzer's book. It's not included in the 4 levels of happiness model, but it's definitely worth looking into emotional processing, because that feeling of inferiority or needing as if you have to prove something in order to be worthy of attention or being liked definitely comes from a poor sense of self. We'll be covering this way, way later, or in the coming weeks, anyways. But in the meantime, I would certainly recommend taking a step back and thinking about your insecurities and actually articulating them on a pen and like with a pen and paper, or type it out, just get it out somewhere where you could actually look at it. And then think about if they actually apply to you. Because chances are a label was put on us at some point in our lives, typically early on, but it's either going to be by yourself or by someone else. And we took that label with us throughout our lives. And instead of brushing it off, we let it limit our beliefs about ourselves. And we just took it with us when really it probably didn't even apply at all, or we've at least grown out of it. But we're still letting it hold us back. So if you do have some kind of preconceived notion about yourself that's discouraging you from taking risks or making certain decisions, like, I'm not going to ask out that girl because she's just going to say no. I'm not going to apply to that job because why bother? I'm not going to get it. Right? Why bother doing anything because I'm not good enough? So it's just going to fail anyways. When we have these kinds of thoughts, it's certainly worth reflecting on, and we need to actually articulate them as the first step to seeing if they really apply at all. And chances are they don't. Overall, though, because we're still on the happiness whole thing, both levels, not a very good way to live your life. If you stick to these two, levels 1 and 2, you will die alone and depressed. And so these are just things to think about. And so now we'll go to level 3, which is called altruism.
Here we started our baseline, and you'll notice that there's a lot of little peaks and valleys, right? And so usually when altruism occurs, it's not going to be something immediately pleasurable to us because it's part of a relationship with something, right? And so each little peak and valley is going to be some sort of progress that you're making with respect to this thing. It could be a business. It could be a marriage. It could be just a normal friendship, or the example that I used before was actually helping a drug addict, right? And so each little peak, and you're actually inclining your way up, is when they're making progress, right? Because now you're devoted to something a bit bigger than yourself. So the reason why there are little dips is because usually when you devote yourself to some sort of commitment like that, it's not going to bring any immediate satisfaction, right? Like if you're grinding for a business, after each day, you still don't have the reward that you'll have 10 years from now. And you're going to be like, wow, this sucks. I have to keep doing this for X amount of years before I get any traction or the paycheck that I want. Or maybe when you're doing charitable work for someone else, you don't actually get a reward, right? So you just lost time for nothing, essentially, just for someone else's benefit. That's not immediately helpful to you. And that's why there could be, very commonly, it happens even to me, especially to me, that sort of moment where you're like, wow, was it really worth it? But I mean, later on, you feel like, oh, okay, well, it was worth it because your relationship improves, right? That's why we have that incline upwards overall, because you're still making progress in whatever you want to do. Yeah. And so it could be that marriage, that business, that friendship. But the only time where it's actually really, really dangerous is when we invest too much of our time into one particular thing. And we really have to remember that we are not in control of everything. And that's where anxiety really comes from. Because we could think about, we could do our best, but they could still cheat. They could still leave you. Your business could still fail. A second Rona could hit, or maybe a car just drives right through your store. Like things could happen. Or in the example I gave you last time, maybe that drug addict relapses, and so all that progress seemingly goes to waste, and that's where it crashes. Right? And so we really just got to remember or take a much more holistic and reasonable approach to things, because we got to realize the only thing that we can control is in here. We can only ever do our best. And if we've done our best and we've done all we could with respect to any sort of situation, then honestly, it's out of our hands.
Yeah.
Because if that's the only thing we can control, that should really be the only thing that we could worry about, right? If you are the perfect partner, you did all you could. You tried to communicate as best you could with your partner, and she still cheats. That is not a reflection of you. Even though you will feel like shit, you will want to kill yourself. Absolutely. I completely understand. But that is not a reflection of you, right? Because you did all you could. It's someone else who's the issue, and you can't control other people, right? And that's where the anxiety comes from, because we try to apply our own control to things that are out of our control. And so that's when I start worrying about if I'm going to get promoted. That's when I'm worrying about if she's going to cheat. You know? Things like that. And so that's where altruism really hits hard. Arguably way worse than level 1 or 2, because at least level 3 actually requires that sort of dedication, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult to get out of that, especially if it's something like a relationship that's gone on for several years, and then you got to start off from the beginning, if you could find it within yourself to trust someone again, you know?
Again,
but that really relates back to the internal work, because when you can internalize that you tried to control something out of your control, you're going to bounce back way, way quicker, right? And that just comes to more of your perception of self. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because when she cheats or if she leaves you or something, you know, maybe the spark is lost. You know, easy example, relationships. You're going to think of immediately, what did I do wrong? Why did she choose someone else? Exactly. But you really got to remember then that even if you did the best you could, and you actually do that, it's not like, oh yeah, I told her I loved her once in a while, you know, whatever, right? You know, like let's actually do the best we can, right? Let's actually make it so that we have no real excuses for ourselves. Like, I did everything I was supposed to. I did the best I could. That's on her, right? When we realize that whatever happens to us isn't necessarily a reflection of ourselves, that has exactly to do with our self-esteem and self-image, right? And that alone could get you through easily the worst of tragedies. Because if she cheats and you realize that, it's like, oh, okay, well, we encounter shitty people all the time. We know that the vast majority of people out there are shitty. She just happened to be one of them.
Yeah.
You know, it's no reflection of us, because we know we did a great job. And we just have to find someone on that same wavelength. And then it all comes back to open communication and actually communicating what you want to be to each other.
It sounds like a lot of work, but damn, it's worth it.
Well, look at the fucking decline, dude.
Yeah.
I mean,
right? The
and so
decline, you know.
it does take a lot of work, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, mind you, in level 3, because you're putting your trust in things that essentially could fail, you don't actually need to do it. You know?
What?
And so I mean, you don't have to get married in order to live a fulfilling life. Right? Like there are way more facets to life that could make life beautiful, right? But the only thing that really gets us is that we've over-sexualized pretty much everything, right? And so now the general sentiment is that I need someone else to validate my existence, which is usually in the form of a relationship, because everything's over-sexualized, and that's, you know, typically where sex happens, unless, of course, you know, we're family members, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, Sweet Home Alabama.
That has. But overall, we really got to think about what other areas of our lives that we're missing out on or that we're not maintaining because we're so fixated on something we don't have, which is maybe a business, maybe it's money, maybe it's a relationship. You know, it could be really anything. But we just got to make sure that we're not putting all our eggs into something that could fail, right? Which is exactly what level 3 is. Like, these are good things in level 3, right? They build communities, right? They make people's lives better. That decline is kind of optional, but it's also without our control, right? So that's just something that we really have to maintain. Because if you don't have that drop, then sure, you can just keep going up and up, but just be careful in case you do get a drop, you know?
Oh, so this is like gambling, right?
Not exactly. I wouldn't say that because, well, okay. No, don't apologize, really. If you have a relationship, let's say, because it's the fucking easiest. It's the easiest one to go off of. If you have a decent relationship and you're employing trust, loyalty, commitment, open communication, and you're able to articulate all your concerns effectively, they're willing to hear you out. And they should, absolutely, because if they care about the connection that you guys have, they want to be genuine. They should absolutely love you enough to be like, oh, okay, well, my partner has something bugging them. I should absolutely hear them out, and I would make time out of my day to help that, right? Because you're partners, right? And so you can avoid a lot of the terrible sort of situations a lot of people land themselves in through openly communicating, right? And so if you use that little script I gave before, you know, it's like, oh, something's been bugging me. Could we talk about it? I'd like to get your thoughts on it. And then they don't make any effort to hear you out or hear your concerns, or they're just not negotiating with you at all. Then maybe they're just not the one. You know?
Yeah.
Because then maybe you should just cut your losses if they're not willing to actually be there for you. Because then that doesn't sound like commitment to me. That doesn't sound like trust to me. Certainly not loyalty. If they don't care about what's bugging you with respect to the actual relationship itself, that's crazy. That's crazy. You should be able to have those difficult conversations. Otherwise, you just have a friend. Like not even that, an acquaintance. You know?
Yeah.
It's just shared experiences. Yeah.
And so if they don't do that for you, you should, if you're in a relationship like that, obviously you don't have to tell me, of course. but if you are in a relationship like that, that could certainly be fixed with open communication, right? Because when you are able to articulate what you actually want to be to each other and really get a solid foundational understanding of where you both are, and you get on that same page, then that's really it. That's where the connection is. Because then you're able to build up from there, right? Because then you're able to set expectations. Then you know they can have that difficult conversation with you. And those should be absolutely essential values to bring towards any sort of meaningful relationship. Not your boss, who gives a fuck, but your close friends, the family members that you do like, and certainly your partner. The partner one is actually not negotiable. Like, imagine, right? But that's why the divorce rate's so high. Because no one is really going about it in a decent and healthy way. Like, go on any sort of relationship-based forum. Like, ooh, I have this problem. How do I fix it? How do I bring it up? You fucking talk to them. What do you mean? What are you retarded? Like, just talk to them. Just give them the same sentiments you're giving the stupid forum that you're asking strangers for help with. If they hear you out, if they actually love you, they will hear you out, and they will try to be understanding, and they will try to be accommodating. And you'll at least
of asking Reddit.
Exactly. you'll at least have this middle ground where you could both come to the table and be like, we should talk about this because it's important to us. And if it's something important to you, it should by default be important to them, especially if it impacts the relationship. I'm not talking about like hobbies and stupid stuff like that.
The actual relationship, yeah.
Exactly. Things that actually involve and impact your connection with them. And if they can't have that difficult conversation, if they're not even willing to show up for you, my guy, it's all looking good.
It's time.
Yeah, dead ass. And then you just have to find someone who you can have a difficult conversation with.
All right. It's kind of hard though, but
100% it is. But that's also luckily why it's not absolutely mandatory for happiness.
Yeah.
Right? Because think about it like this. If relationships were the main form of happiness in life, then everyone in one would automatically be like among the happiest people around. Look at our divorce rates. Look at broken families. Look at perhaps even your own relationships. Like, are you happy in them? I hope so. I hope you're communicating just like I'm communicating all these things to you right now. But the chances are like kind of low. No one really knows about these sorts of things, or not enough people actually give it any thought. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's when we actually adopt these sorts of practices that we make way better connections. Sure, fewer connections because less people are actually willing to go through this process. But these are the ride or dies that you can make using these things. Absolutely. And it makes your life so much more meaningful, so much more beautiful. And it's absolutely worth it. Because the people who aren't willing to have those conversations or who aren't going to be there for you, they're not worth your time. Straight up.
Yeah.
You have to commit. If I commit, you commit.
Absolutely. And that has to be communicated on both ends. Because relationships are a two-way street, right?
Yeah.
Like that.
Damn.
Okay, this is an old one, but it's the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals. If I'm just sending you all this love and I'm not getting anything in return, right?
Yeah. Fucking sucks.
Yeah. Then our country's going to shit.
Exactly.
We ain't tolerant of that.
Do you think it's helpful if I lay it out in the first days of the relationship,
Absolutely. Honestly, on the first date, like a lot of people, they try and they don't even touch anything like remotely controversial. Right?
Oh yeah.
I think that is fuck that. I think that is the opportune time to actually get to know them. Because why would I want to waste any time with you 3, 4, 5 months down the line, not really knowing who you are or what you actually want in a relationship?
Yeah.
Like you need to set these things out. Like you need to make your intent very, very clear and articulate your thoughts effectively.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you want in the relationship? What are your goals? Do you want kids or not? Like think long term. It's like, what do you actually want to be to someone? And then you see if they're able to do that: trust, loyalty, commitment, open communication. I mean, it's certainly hard to gauge all those 4 things, but open communication is going to be very, very easy, even in the beginning, because they should at least be willing to have that kind of conversation with you, right? If they're not, then they're gone. Then that's a really easy, good indicator. Then just like, okay, well, I had a great time. I just don't really feel as if we connect enough. Good luck at that.
Yeah, this business deal is not gonna work out. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Then you're gonna do the Donald Trump face.
Mm-hmm.
You're fired.
Exactly. You're gonna fire him on the spot.
All right, it's actually a good point. I'm gonna take that down. Is it okay if
you take notes?
be blunt? No. I
I
mean,
mean,
still with the level 3. Being blunt, does that help in
in terms of
altruism?
being blunt, you altruism really isn't about being blunt or communicating any one particular way.
Oh
It's
yeah.
more about how you are actually getting your source of happiness, right? Like the
Oh, okay.
whole point is that we don't want to put all our little happiness eggs into something that could fail. And that means a relationship. That means a business. That
Yeah.
means, whatever endeavor maybe we're trying to help people. Like these are all good things to have in your life, but they shouldn't be the focus of it. Right? Like especially relationships, they should be complementing an already meaningful life. They shouldn't be the focus of it. Because now we're putting all our happiness into something that could fail, right? And that's
Oh yeah.
also something out of our control. And that's very,
Okay.
very dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Why would? Damn, I'm really just really, what do you call that? I'm
Mind
really
blown?
stunned by, mind blown by all this. Like I've made decisions, shaped my decisions to be. I've done the opposite. I've put all my eggs into something that could fail, and then it fails, and then now I'm fucked.
Yeah.
I've done that a lot. That's why I'm
Absolutely.
reacting
No,
like
it's
this.
I mean, it happens to everyone. Like it's not really something to be ashamed of because it's just part of us learning these things. And usually, I mean, people don't even get to know all these different things and actually think about it in this way. They never really take that step back because then they just start looking for the next thing. At least we actually know the name of the game now.
Yeah. Now I see. Okay. There are levels like that.
Exactly.
That's really good.
And that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy things. That doesn't mean you can't tell a funny story to your friends. And that doesn't mean you can't have relationships or businesses or anything, right? You could be in all 3 levels or all 4 levels at once. It's just a matter of where you're putting all your eggs.
So in that run of level 3, I really focused on the more practical aspect of it, and that was my own spin. In the book from Dr. Spitzer, he puts a bit more emphasis on the moral aspect of it, where we would do good things because they are good to do, not necessarily just because they benefit us. And it's that transition that we take when we actually start doing things for a bigger purpose and things that are outside of us. And so it's pretty much that stepping away from being self-centered, right? Levels 1 and 2, they were all about us, but now we're starting to step a little bit outside of ourselves and start to focusing on other people. So we incorporate people in a bit of a healthier way this time in level 3 as compared to level 2. And in episode 0, I focused on commitments to things a little more. But now, instead of incorporating people toxically, the peaks and valleys that I talk about in the graph, they're still true because the benefits that still come from doing these things are always going to be there, albeit not always immediate. And if we're being real, charity does kind of suck in the moment because we're not actually getting anything out of it, right? It's not an attractive value proposition to anyone to go out there or to go out of your way to do something for free using our own resources and getting nothing in return. Like, it's always going to be a shitty deal for us. But it's only after the fact that we start to see any kind of benefit. Like maybe it's feeling good because you did something good for others, or maybe it's strengthening a friendship, or just bettering our overall environment, whatever. Right? These things aren't immediately apparent, and so we don't really feel that way when we're doing it in the moment. It's always after that we ever kind of feel any kind of return. Maybe I'm different. I don't know. But that's just my experience anyways. Maybe I'm an asshole. But one other thing I want to touch on is counterfeit charity. Right? So it's level 2 masquerading as level 3. Right? True charity occurs when no one's watching. And level 3 includes the intent to do good, right? Which is a true intent, where things aren't all about you anymore, like in the first two. The levels, we can look at them overall, they essentially depict the degree to which we are self-detached, right? We don't have the inclination, or we don't need the inclination to do all these good things. And that's totally understandable, because charity starts off when we start to get secure and when we start to actually think about these things at a deeper level, right? It usually starts at home. So if you're going to do anything at all, obviously you're going to start with people that you actually like, right? And so charity is driven by level 4 anyways, so we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But if the concept of charity isn't immediately attractive, you are not the Antichrist, you're just a normal person. We usually encounter failure, actually, when we think about things outside of our control, right? When they fail us, like in the example where we were helping a drug addict, or when a when a car drives through your business, as an example of things outside of our control. That's why I covered internal work and more of the practical aspect. Because even though it's not included in the actual framework, we need the internal work to keep us afloat in those scenarios. Because the root of anxiety, if you remember, is the imposition of our own control on things outside of our control. That's when we start to worry about what other people are doing, or what they're thinking of us, or what could happen to us, or what other people are going to say if we come to them with a concern, or we come to them with constructive feedback. It's always really valuable to reiterate that we need that internal work so that we stay grounded in every scenario, whether we have the philosophy or not, whether we have a decent idea of happiness or not. It's going to make a profound change. And we need to realize that even if things do fail, like when level 3 crashes, at that point, it is out of our hands. When that drug addict relapses, or when that business fails, or when that marriage fails, it is out of our hands because those things are reliant on others as well. Right? If it were just on you, then it probably would be fine if you're the one stressing out about it. Because if you're the one stressing out about it, chances are you're doing everything you can. You're doing the best you can. And when things go to shit, we have to realize that we can't control other people. Or even if we do know it, we really have to internalize that. Because then, if we internalize that, then we're not actually going to be anxious at all about these sorts of things. You can't help someone who wants to be helped, for example. And so, we shouldn't ruin ourselves in any way, or sacrifice more time or more resources for someone who doesn't appreciate our efforts, or is unresponsive to them, or is simply not putting in the effort to better themselves that you would like them to, and are giving them an environment to. If you did your best and it didn't work out, it's out of your hands. And if you did your best and it didn't work out, the only thing you could really do is chill. Because you can't do anything about it anyways. So you just got to take care of yourself. Another way we could be discouraged, though, is based off of temperaments. If we're helping people, then we got to deal with them really as they are. And if we are helping people in any kind of way, chances are they're not in the state where they're going to be very agreeable, or, they're not having the greatest time of their lives. Right? So if it's kind of like an emotional help, then you're never going to see them in a very good light. Or it's going to be very difficult to contend with because these things are making everyone distraught, right? Because we always have a terrible experience or a negative response to seeing others suffer, especially the ones that we care for. And one thing we've got to be careful of is how deeply this actually impacts us. Because then we might actually be in the scenario where we don't really want to do good anymore. And this is a completely understandable position, right? If you are constantly bombarded with negativity or with very negative realities of the lived experience of other people, it's very easy to become discouraged, especially if you're trying to do good and they aren't responsive, right? Like, I tried to help you and you burned me. Fuck you. You know, I tried to be a loving partner and you cheated on me. Fuck you. Yeah. It's understandable to be resentful. And so while it's certainly important to help people in general, we got to be mindful that we also deserve love too. And we need to be also investing in ourselves, because if we only invest in others, that could be too draining and too damaging to us. I know level 3 is about shifting our focus outside of ourselves, right? And so, although we aren't obligated to get married or join a community or help every struggling person we come across or start a business or like embark on some great big journey, it's about mainly helping people when you can and starting to care for others in healthy ways. And when you're starting to do that, you're already on the right track, because then you're at least shifting your focus away from levels 1 and 2. And one thing that I stumbled upon that was actually kind of cool was this little study from Ohio State University. Let me just pull it up. They took a very small sample size, 122 people, with moderate to severe depression, anxiety, or stress symptoms, and they saw how acts of kindness measured up against things like behavioral therapy or planning social activities to reduce those symptoms. So they mainly cared about the social aspect instead of therapies and medications. They found that the participants in the acts of kindness group experienced the most benefits in all dimensions, and they were life satisfaction and reduction of depression and anxiety symptoms. And so I just thought it would be a really cool tidbit to include that, because there are even physiological responses and even incentives then to doing good, right? Even if we take away all the philosophy bullshit, even if we stop caring about the 4 levels and, you know, the different forms of happiness and what we're focusing on, there still is, at its core, an incentive to do good. Right? Imagine if we went all in on like level 1 and feeling good, but by doing good. We'd be wilding. And so this it has some pretty cool implications when we start to talk about if people are inherently good or not. And the answer is yes, by the way. And although level 3 is nice to think about, I'm aware it sounds pretty unrealistic for a lot of people. And I can understand that. Like, if there's nothing in it for me, chances are I'm not going to do it. And we may not want to admit that publicly, but I totally get the sentiment. We need to be getting something out of it, at least in the long term, if we're going to be doing something at all, right? Especially if we're going to be devoting ourselves to something higher or to something outside of ourselves. There's nothing to be ashamed of if we want something for us as well. Because I'll be the first to say it. I'm not going to burn myself out for a pat on the back. I'm not going to cry at every story of someone suffering just so I could say that I'm sympathetic or an empath. That doesn't make me a terrible person. regardless of whatever self-righteous doormat tells you, so that they could, fake their moral high ground. I really just think it's level 2 masquerading as level 3 in that case, right? We get our personal incentives to do good with level 4. And we don't need to be billionaire philanthropists to make a difference. And the mentality of detachment is really important in level 3. Because then that detachment also incorporates level 4 because our focus is shifted higher, right? Like, if I did my best, if it fails, whatever. As long as I'm on the right track. And the easiest way for us to really start doing good in this way, and to not see it as a chore, would be to have the kind of drive that gives meaning to our actions. And that drive that we get, and that incentive that we get, is our why. And that's exactly what level 4 is. And that's simply how goodness starts. So now we'll move on to level 4.
Level 4, which is the desire of perfection. And so with level 4, we acknowledge that, well, really, this one brings in philosophy. And so with philosophy, it's really, really great because then we start to answer life's big questions. And one of the biggest ones that I really like to hone in on in particular is the existence of God, right? Like, if it exists or not. God as a concept. We don't have to use religion for this. We don't have to really touch on anything incendiary. We're thinking of God as a concept and seeing if it's a viable one. And so I'm not really going to get into the different reasons as to why there isn't a God. But one thing that I would like to leave you with is something called Pascal's wager. Maybe you've heard about it before, maybe not. But it's essentially a non-religious sort of, I guess, situational moral question that gives us 4 potential outcomes of our lives if God exists or he doesn't, right? So let's assume that God does exist, for example, for this little thought experiment.
Okay.
And so we live well because in this one, we're theists. We believe in something. We believe in God, and we live by this little moral code, whichever one we choose. That means usually living well, we help people, etc. All the things involved in that. We live a meaningful life because we actually think that we're on the right path. If God exists and when we die, we go to heaven, right? Great.
Yeah.
So that's one outcome. If God exists and we don't do any of those, we default to levels 1 and 2 because we think, I'm not going to do all those stupid rules that religion prescribes. I'm just going to do whatever I want. So that means I'm going to go down hedonism, instant gratification. I'm going to want power, ego gratification, right? Because those are the 2 things that we default to without any sort of direction. Then, if God exists and we die, chances are we didn't really look out for anyone else. We didn't really care about improving anyone else's lives besides our own. And so, naturally, hopefully not, but we'd go to hell, right?
Yeah.
Now, for if God doesn't exist and we live well, we live arguably for others as well as ourselves. We live decently or meaningfully anyways. And usually that also comes with peace and death because we expect something great on the other side, right?
Yeah.
If we live that kind of lifestyle, even if God doesn't exist, that's it. Nothing really happens. Like, the worst case scenario is that we live a meaningful life and we have improved the lives of others, which is something that even atheists try and do.
Oh.
Right? So then we have this great meaningful life that's decent, and that's it. We die, curtains drawn, but no God, so nothing happens. So we just live well, and that's it. And then on the flip side, we can be greedy, we can be materialistic, we can do whatever we want. We just max out levels 1 and 2, everything we want to do. which, I mean, mind you, usually lands us in depressive states because of like the declining nature of levels 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And there also comes with a certain degree of nihilism that comes with that, because, you know, especially when you think of, ooh, I did everything right, and here I am still on this cycle. Is this all there is to life? Right? That's also referred to as the hedonic treadmill, because it just keeps going and going. If we live like that, seeing life as practically meaningless or depressive, and we die, then that's it. But we just live kind of a subpar experience, you know? The story ends there.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so really the only thing that I'd like you guys to take away with respect to the existence of God is that even if you have no religious affiliation, because granted, we didn't really get to that. I didn't really know you all that well. There is still an incentive towards belief, right? Even if it's
There
all
is.
bullshit, you would still live a meaningful life, provided that you do it well and you actually internalize these decent values, right? Because at least you think you're on the right track, even if it's all fake, right? That doesn't
Yeah.
matter, because you think you're doing good. And you think there's something on the other side, and that will give you hope. That will give you a decent approach to suffering.
Wow, that is so nice. You know?
It's crazy. So even if it's all bullshit, we still come out on top.
Yeah, you know. Hope. It comes down to that.
So, in episode 0, I kind of jumped the gun and went straight into the wager when I probably should have done more background. I started off with a wager because it was really simple and really gives us a strong incentive for belief. And there really isn't much to argue, right? There aren't many other angles you could attack it from. It's very, very plain Jane. Just here are your options. Are you gonna win in this one or lose in that one? Right? It's pretty simple. But since we covered already how the social and material relate to our lived experience in the previous levels, the only area left to cover is the spiritual. So let's talk about faith a little bit in general and what that could do for us at a personal level. Because I think if we have a solid foundation and approach, then we don't really have any opportunity to crash like all the other levels, because we're either on this journey or we're not. And this journey it's great because it discourages us from going all in on the other levels. There was a 2016 study from the Journal of the American Medical Association that covered the relationship between religious service attendance and suicide rates. Among 89,708 American women between the ages of 30 and 55 that participated, those that attended a service once a week or more were associated with a 5-fold lower rate of suicide when compared to those that never attended religious services. And that's pretty significant. There tend about to be a few more studies in that same vein that suggest like pretty much the same thing, but this definitely illustrates the point just fine. And I thought it was pretty interesting. And another benefit that we get is when we at least avail ourselves to things that are spiritual, like that always breeds some form of community. And we don't even really have to be a member of it, but the option is at least there so that we feel a part of something. And by extension, we also get a kind of support network that is at least available, even if you don't partake. We get a general guideline as to how to live as well, or a lens through which we can see the world, so that we have some sense of mental or moral stability, instead of just going along with the popular opinion at the time or whatever you feel is right at the time. And this is why in the graph, it's just a straight line upwards. It's just progress in that right direction without any opportunity for a drop. Because it's a never-ending journey, and we'll never really get to the end when we're dead. And so you're really playing off of a standard that isn't really changing because these kinds of values don't change, right? Regardless of the age that we find ourselves in, Pascal's wager is always going to be the same. So our views on happiness aren't really subject to change. We could find these phenomenon in every age. People always love to drink from the very beginning, right? People were always trying to get to the top of the food chain and trying to be the best over other people. Always happened. People always also try to do good, like in level 3. And people were always religious, like in level 4, or at least thought about spirituality. And if we're talking about people not of faith, typically the goals for level 4 would presumably be to satiate human curiosity, or be a part of a community, or have some kind of creative outlets or achievements. But as I see it, when you take the non-spiritual approaches to things and we label that as level 4, we're just going to find ourselves in a cycle again. Because what are we going to do once we find out the answer to some big scientific question? We're just going to move on to the next one. Or how about when we finish that painting that we've been working on for ages? What are we going to do? We're either going to go on to the next one or sell it, right? Or once you achieve something that you're going to just look for another accolade after you're done. Chances are you're not just going to stay stagnant, because overall, other people are still going to be achieving things, and you're going to think about yourself in relation to that. When we take these very, very basic approaches, we're always going to end up falling to things that are immediate and apparent. So true level 4 can only ever really be found in that faith-based approach, because it's about the only kind of happiness that isn't cyclic, right? It's a fair game for everyone, regardless of their abilities, right? Because if you think happiness is X, but you can't achieve it, are you screwed, right? Is it over for you? Like, what if X is climbing Mount Everest or getting a Nobel Prize? Does that mean that everyone who can't is just fucked? Like, certainly not. But if happiness is something we all strive for, it's possible for everyone. And we talked about this in previous episodes too. If we are innately drawn to it, that means it's real. That we're at least capable of achieving it. Because if it weren't real and it were just a farce, it was fake, it wouldn't be a thing. We wouldn't be drawn to it. We wouldn't know it's there. And that means everyone is capable of finding happiness because everyone wants it. Otherwise, we would have these people who don't actually chase happiness because it simply doesn't exist to them. But none of those people exist. All of us chase that same thing, which is happiness, but we just look in different places. And so it's consoling to know that we don't have to be athletes or geniuses in order to find happiness. And if it's not required to have some decent amount of ability, then what could be so simple that anyone could achieve it? And that answer is to find God. And there's another connection I want to make. Level 4 drives level 3, right? And it encourages us to make the world around us better, regardless of our position in life. We don't need to be philanthropists or billionaires, like I said. And this drive enables us to do good, even if we see a crash in level 3. Because then our focus should be shifting towards the intent to make a difference. Right? This ties on a bit of the perspective versus reality and internal work that goes along with it. And when we acknowledge that we can't control others, we have to realize that their results are not necessarily indicative of our performance. Right? If we did the best we could to support them, if we've done the right thing, it stops there. Right? If they overcome whatever, fantastic. But if they eat shit, then that doesn't necessarily mean that we did poorly and we'll be on the hook for that. It doesn't really reflect anything about us. And this is really how detachment manifests itself in our lives, which is something common to all religions anyways. Because all of them have some degree of detachment. But the internal work really puts that perspective into play, and it makes it way easier to process. We become so focused then on whatever we think will get us to heaven, which is doing whatever we think is good here and there, right? Not necessarily what other people do. So it's really all about our intent and what we're doing. Now let's try and throw a wrench into what I said. Since I've seen some people touch on this, that we would all live happily ever after if we had no poverty in the world. Like if we had lives devoid of any material need, if we had an abundance of everything, and no one had to work jobs or anything like that, would that suffice for happiness and eliminate our need for something higher? On the surface, it's definitely a good thing to strive for, like alleviation of poverty. Wonderful. More idle time to dick around with your friends. For sure. Love that. But it's not a comprehensive solution to life, and especially not a satisfactory life. Because if it were as simple as material need, then we wouldn't have the situation that we do, where first world countries have higher suicide rates than third. Or we wouldn't see retirees going back into the workforce or volunteering because they get bored. Or it's not just idle time and having all your physical needs met and getting chill, because chances are we still try and find things outside of ourselves anyways, right? Usually things that are self-serving, and we just find ourselves in that cycle. We already have these phenomenon even when we don't have an abundance of everything, because having your needs met and having idle time and things like that, it's not a real substitute for meaning. Because if there's nothing to worry about, and we have all this abundance, and we don't really have to care about really anything, we're just going to go for whatever's immediate and apparent anyways. And if we're going to go for bullshit things like that, what makes you think that we're going to live very meaningful lives in that kind of scenario anyways? Right? Because then that just means going for all of our tempting vices, and we're just going to spiral downwards. Because we just throw ourselves back into a cycle. And with that abundance, and seeing the kinds of problems we have in the modern day, what makes you think that people are going to suddenly change their lives and we wouldn't end up in the hospital beds being pumped full of whatever things make us feel great? Right? Typically, we see that as a dystopian scenario, because we know that it's not what a meaningful life looks like. And so we don't go to the drug addicts and say, oh, fuck, I could really learn something from him. Right? We don't see living for food, sex, and money as a meaningful experience, unless you have like an IQ below 80. So even if things were super easy for us on like a society-wide scale, like a worldwide scale, everyone's got in the same boat. The only way for us to avoid going all in on levels 1 and 2 is with meaning. Because when we look beyond ourselves and we see how traditionally meaning-led people lived, It's hard because it's religion, right? And a lot of religious people just suck. I get it. At least the ones we usually get exposed to. Typically, we only ever see or hear the ones that do suck, right? The ones that can't communicate their values effectively, or they just can't justify or defend any of their beliefs at all. And people don't really live up to their own ideals in their own religion, but they'll still expect you to live up to them, and they'll tell you you're going to hell if you're not on board. Right? These people sound, or rather they are, repulsive, stupid, and they do make the whole thing seem like bullshit. I completely understand. But that's also why we went through Pascal's wager. Because at the very least, it gives us an incentive to look beyond. Not at the asshole telling you you'll go to hell for any small thing you do. Not at the retard boomer who prods and pokes with whatever incendiary talking points they can at family gatherings. But when we see that happiness is so much more than pleasure, comfort, social status, or being at the top of our game, and that it's really found in a strong sense of purpose and meaning that makes sense, that's when everything changes. And that satisfying purpose is only ever found when we direct our gaze upwards. If spirituality is the only real area that we haven't explored in our lives, let's see if we can make sense of it. Because Pascal's wager tells us that living with belief is probably our best bet. But now the question is, how can we know if God really exists? And that's what we cover next. If you resonated with what we covered today and want to learn more about how to live meaningfully, subscribe to the show so that you can grow with me and everyone else listening who are also on their journeys to take back control of their lives. And one thing that I'd recommend you to do is to talk about the things that we covered today with someone, even just one person, because that not only makes it real to you, it also gets someone else to start thinking about things that could make their lives more meaningful. Worst case, if you hate it, you can always subscribe anyways. But thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to growing with you in the future.